Um, let's see if this can this be adjusted a little. Perhaps this is too loud. Well, perhaps not. In any case, I think we are on the live feed. My name is Holger Klein. I'm the director of the Sakıp Sabancı Center for Turkish Studies in New York at Columbia University. And it's a pleasure to be with the shift this week here in Venice. The topic of our workshops is a topic that is entitled Venice and Constantinople, Istanbul, Bridging the Mediterranean Divide. And one of the things that we are trying to do is find traces of the presence of Byzantine art and culture, Byzantine architecture and culture here in Venice, as well as Ottoman traces. I think that's better, yeah. Wonderful. We have various workshop components. Yesterday we visited the Piazza San Marco and the Piazzetta, talked a lot about San Marco and the facades of San Marco, and how they show the impact of these different cultural exchanges that happen over time from the 9th century across to the 13th and 14th century. Today, it's a pleasure to introduce Professor Deborah Howard to you. Professor Howard is a Professor Emerita at the University of Cambridge, where she has taught since 1992. And she is now a Professor Emerita of Cambridge University and a Fellow of St. John's College. And she has served as the head of the Department of Art History from 2002 to 2009. And she graduated from both the University of Cambridge and the Courtauld Institute of Art in London, and has taught at the Courtauld Institute as well as the University College, Edinburgh University, and other places, including Yale University as a visiting professor. She is now a Leverhulme Fellow and is investigating technological invention and architecture in the Veneto in the early modern period. So a new project that brings her to the terraferma and to Venice, of course, a lot. Deborah Howard's work has been on Venice, as you read in the texts that were selected in preparation for this workshop. And we are happy to have her here today to talk about Venice and the impact of the Ottoman Empire on the architecture and art and culture of Venice. So welcome, Deborah. We're glad that you could join us.
Well, thank you very much. It's a great privilege to be here, and it's wonderful to meet you all. I have been interested in connections between Venice and the Islamic world for, well, over 30 years, if not more. I was rather impatient, really, with the attitude of scholars on Venice towards this subject, because the histories were all about tensions and problems and wars and disputes. And if you read the official documentation, that's the case. I mean, if you think about today's situation, you know, we ought all to be terrible enemies if you read the official documents of what's going on politically. And I found that when I looked at private documents or people's diaries, their letters, the experiences of travelers, you got a totally different picture. And they seem to be able to carry on getting along and trading and interacting in a very fruitful way. And this idea of constant friction and tension, which is a legacy really from the Crusades of the Middle Ages, seemed to me to be all wrong. So I began to think about this, and I published an article in 1990 just sort of exploring the subject, and then I began to work on it seriously. And I published a book called Venice and the East in 2000, which actually I think opened up a lot of future work. There were several exhibitions in the early 2000s, including a wonderful exhibition at the Met in New York, which was also in Paris and in Venice, exploring this subject. So I think now people would think it's a rather normal subject to study, but when I began thinking about it, there was very, very little literature about it. Venice and Byzantium had been studied a lot. But anyway, what I want to do is to give you a sort of very brief summary of some of the conclusions in my book on Venice and the East, just to lay out where we're starting, and then talk more about the Ottomans. So now you've been yesterday to San Marco, and obviously Venice began as a sort of colony of Byzantium, and gradually, little by little, began to assert her independence, culturally, politically, in religious terms, and so on. But if you go into San Marco, you can see the Byzantine legacy, well, from the outside too, but even especially really in the inside. And if you look at Hagia Sophia on the right and San Marco on the left, you can see you've got rich marbles at the bottom, including marble paneling, facet cut marble that has watery effect on the walls. You've got mosaics above. You've got a similar way of illuminating these pendentive domes with small windows all the way around the base of the dome, which means that light comes in at all times of day and twinkles. The surfaces of the mosaics are sort of rough. So you have this mysterious sort of flickering illumination. And both of these buildings have very dark, mysterious edges, so that if you stand in the middle, you wouldn't really very easily be able to draw the plan, because you can't see where the space ends. You're in a light space in the middle of this sort of dark penumbra around. So San Marco was built to receive the body of St. Mark, as you know, which was taken from Alexandria by Venetian merchants in 828 or 829, we don't quite know. And that was the beginning of a process of gradual assertion of Venetian identity and independence. Venice began trading very early with the Islamic world. We know this from things that you can see in the treasury in San Marco. Here are two examples. The beautiful glass bowl on the left has become opaque with time, but it's a very fine piece of Islamic glass with these wonderful relief hairs running around the bottom. The jug on the right belonged to a famous caliph called Al-Aziz Billah, whose name is written in Arabic around the top. But both of these items have been transformed into Christian objects by putting them in Byzantine mounts. So this is a kind of process of appropriation, that is to say, taking something Islamic, transforming it into something that could have a kind of a Venetian, and in this case, Christian identity. And so all these transcultural borrowings involve transformations of various kinds, and that's really something we're going to be talking about. Of course, you know about the Fourth Crusade, and no doubt you will have been talking about it yesterday. So I don't need to tell you what happened in 1204, but the result was that the Venetians brought enormous quantities of marbles and treasures, including probably the 4 horses, and these beautiful porphyry columns around the main door of St. Mark's come from Constantinople at the time of the Fourth Crusade. And porphyry, I'm sure you know a lot about porphyry because you can see lots of it in Istanbul, but it's a very, very hard, very beautiful stone, which is very difficult to carve, and it has this wonderful royal purple color. And here you see the doorway given this regal presence by having all these porphyry columns right around the center. On the south side of San Marco, facing towards the water, there are beautiful marbles inlaid into the corner of the building between St. Mark's and the Doge's Palace. Of course, do remember that San Marco was not the Cathedral of Venice. It is now, but it only became so in the early 19th century. It was the private chapel of the Doge. It was the resting place of the remains of the apostle, St. Mark, and it was the center of Venetian state ceremonial. Of course, the ceremonial had a religious aspect, but it is very much a symbol of the Republic of Venice. In front of it are these two beautiful columns, which are also you will have looked at, which are called the Pillars of Acre because they were believed to come from Acre, but actually it's known now that they came from Istanbul, from the Church of St. Polyeuctus, is it called that? And you can see the beautiful porphyry tetrarchs on the corner of the building. Here they are in the snow. I think they look rather wonderful. Now, I do want to stress, and I'm sure you're sort of aware of this, that we now, or maybe you do, but most people don't know their marbles anymore. They don't know how much each kind of marble costs, what is the value, where it comes from. And people at this time would have been much more aware of which marbles were rare and which marbles were cheaper and which marbles were beautiful and which marbles were precious. So these wonderful marbles are inlaid there, and there are also quite a lot with reliefs on. And it's now been shown that quite a lot of these reliefs were not Byzantine reliefs. They were Byzantine-style reliefs made in Venice to make the booty look even more, to make it look as if they hadn't got enough already, that they'd actually got even more things. So already there's this kind of imitation, emulation process going on, and all these beautiful pieces of marble are appropriated, turned into something Christian, put on the edge of the building. And from 1204 onwards, Venice becomes very, very much more powerful, obviously. They set up a Latin state in Constantinople, and trade expands enormously. This is a map of Venice's trade routes in 1212, so that's just 8 years after the Fourth Crusade. And you can see that already established are the route to Egypt, well, through Alexandria, to Syria, through Beirut, and then up onto the Silk Route, going across Central Asia, and into the Black Sea, and into Russia as well. So those were the principal trade routes that made Venice a very, very successful international maritime power. There are other routes that went up into Northern Europe, but they were much less important at this time. So basically, Venetian trade worked by importing valuable goods from the Eastern Mediterranean, from Central Asia, selling them on to merchants who would come from other parts of Europe, especially Northern Europe. They'd come down over the Alps and trade in Venice. And, you know, Venice couldn't possibly use all the stuff they imported themselves. They sold it on. They were a port of exchange. Here you can see on the right-hand side a Venetian galley. And I think it's very important to understand why the galleys were so important. There were two kinds of ships. There were great big round ships, which were used for importing very heavy things like rice or grain or wood, things like that. But the valuable products which Venice imported, which were things like spices, gems, rich textiles, things that were precious but small in volume, they were carried in galleys, which have rather small capacity, but they're very maneuverable because they were rowed by hand. They did have sails, but if you took the sails down and rowed, you could defend yourself, you could maneuver, you could get out of the way of pirates and so on much more easily. And these were the main ships that transported goods between Venice and the East. They were escorted by the state. So the state ran the convoys. They determined which date you set sail, and they defended the convoys. And so Venetian trade was very much under the auspices of the state. And the nobility that governed the Republic was a nobility of merchants. Most parts of Europe at this time were governed by magnates of various kinds whose power lay in landholding. The Venetians really didn't have much land at this point at all. They were merchants, and their whole economy was based on trade, and the way they, in a sense, the way they thought about materiality was very much connected with their experience of trading and interacting in the Eastern Mediterranean. Now, young Venetian nobles from the upper echelons, the upper classes, would be sent as very young teenagers, really, to the East to learn how to trade, to learn Arabic, to learn bookkeeping, so that they would have an experience of this different culture at a time when they were very impressionable. They would know it was different from home, but it was also something that was very deeply impregnated into their culture. And so that the colors, the smells, the decorative motifs, the whole experience of being the light, of being in the Eastern Mediterranean was part of their whole worldview. So traders, now let me see if I can give you an example of this. Now, your architects, if you meet an architect from India, or an architect from South America, an architect from Australia, an architect from Norway, you have a culture that you share. It doesn't matter what your politics are or your religion or anything, you are architects. Merchants are the same. If you're a Venetian Christian and you meet an Islamic merchant on the Silk Route in Syria, you understand each other in a certain way. You know what your values are. And I feel it's very, very important to understand that. Venetians traveled for various reasons. Trade was one of them, diplomacy, which I'll come on to, pilgrimage also, but it so happens that most of the pilgrimage sites that they wanted to see were in the Holy Land, which was for the very large part of its history under Islamic rule. So sometimes they could slip from one of these roles into another. A merchant could become a diplomat, or a merchant could go on a pilgrimage. And each of these groups had slightly different approaches, obviously, to their travels. But in general, this mercantile culture is absolutely the basis of all Venetian visual culture, and that's terribly, terribly important. The Venetians could show this off in fascinating ways. Here are two places where merchants have displayed their Eastern connections on their palaces. These are both up in Cannaregio, near the Madonna dell'Orto. The one on the right is a laden camel with a camel driver. This was a family that had a spice business at Rialto. And the one on the left is one of a series of 4 Oriental figures around the corner of a building. Almost certainly they're Christian religious figures who've just had turbans put on top. If you look at them closely, this man is holding a book. He looks like a holy man, really. The niche has had to be made wider at the top because his head's so big. And they're almost like characters from a comic opera. I mean, it's a sort of display. It's rather like, for example, if you wanted to sell Chinese merchandise, you might hang Chinese lanterns in your shop. I mean, it's a way of saying, you know, we have contacts with the East. Look, here we are. But a lot of the influence is much more subtle and more unconscious almost, and happens more gradually. You can make a parallel with language. There are a lot of Arabic words in Venetian dialect. Most of them are connected with either trade or luxury living, words like caravan or sofa or damask, or they're connected with war, of course, because that was another way in which these cultures interacted. But I mean, if you think of, well, I don't know if this happens in Turkish, but when I was a child, We didn't have the word cappuccino. Spaghetti was something foreign. Now, no, nobody can spell it right, but cappuccino is a part of the English language, and so is spaghetti. And nobody thinks that it's Italian particularly, or they might, but you know, it gradually it becomes impregnated into your culture. And if you think about architectural motifs, you see the same sort of thing can happen. Now, on the left-hand side, you see a very standard Venetian Gothic palace. It's a very nice one from the end of the 14th century, late 1300s. And you can see these windows with pointed arches framed in rectangles with discs in the spandrels in the corner. And that is the motif that you would see in a mihrab. That is how a mihrab is defined in Islamic architecture. And there were portable mihrabs in the form of, as there are today, in the form of carpets or plaques. And this is an example of a ceramic, quite big ceramic mihrab, which is now in Paris. There are quite a number in Western collections, which seems to imply that quite a lot of these came to Europe. And what I think has happened in this case is that somebody brought back one of these, gave it to a mason and said, let's have a window like this. And then because the Venetians are all part of the same social class of nobles who are trying to define themselves through their Oriental culture, they begin to copy each other. They always did copy each other. We know this from documents. You know, the documents about the famous Cadoro talk about the patron, Contarini, his name was, saying to his mason, I would like a window like the Palazzo Sagredo, please make me one. You know, you would copy your motifs from another building that you liked. So they're all sort of imitating each other. They each want to look individual, but they, at the same time, they're part of this common group. So what I think happens is that at some point, somebody makes a mihrab window, and then they just begin to spread. I think the meaning of the mihrab, which is all to do with light and eternity and paradise, slipped away very quickly if it was ever understood. I mean, if you start trying to impose that meaning, paradise, eternity, and so on Venetian palaces, you get into very interesting philosophical ideas. But I think that is too complicated and not really probably plausible. That's my own view. We can discuss this. But, yeah. So Venice then begins to try to, in a certain sense, Islamicize San Marco to make it look more like Egypt and less like Constantinople. And one of the ways they do this is by raising the domes, which were originally rather low Byzantine domes, as they still are inside the building, and put these huge bulbous domes on top, because in burial buildings of the Islamic world, particularly Egypt, that is the sort of symbolic representation of a tomb. So you could make San Marco more appropriate for St. Mark, who was martyred in Alexandria, if you made the domes higher. And the way they did it was by making these enormous outer structures with timber, as you can see there. It couldn't be too heavy or the church would collapse. In fact, it is heavy and it has caused problems, but it's still surviving. But you can see here on the right, the Ibn Tulun Mosque in Cairo being repaired